Hello and welcome to my Xamarin Android video series where you will learn to develop Android applications in C#. My name is Rodolfo Novello, and in this video I'd like to talk to you about fragments. Fragments is an important subject that deserves several lessons since it is an integral component to more effectively deal with different form factors. I want to start out with a basic fragment, the ListFragment, which derives from the ListFragment class. You will learn how to instantiate a fragment, declaring it in the layout file, how the same fragment can be reused in the same application by a second activity, and how to programmatically create and instantiate that same fragment in a third activity. In subsequent lessons, we will learn how to use fragments that derive from the Fragment class. So let's get started. So let's start by creating a blank Android application, and let's call it Fragments Basic. Okay. The first thing we're going to do is, like we did in our previous sample for list view, we're going to create a new class that is going to provide a method to retrieve a set of data that we're going to call getMyData. So let's call it my service. And let me cut and paste so you don't have to watch me do all of this. Okay, here it is, and let's also bring the pictures that we're going to be using for the example. So we can copy them from any other project, and it will add them to our drawable folder, and also make sure that the build action is always Android resource. The first thing we're going to do is create a fragment that we're going to be using. I want you to understand that a fragment is like a little activity. It's like a mini activity that we can reuse in different places of our solution. So what we're going to do is create this new item that's going to be a fragment, and let's call it main fragment. As you can see, the regular fragment inherits from Fragment, from the class Fragment, but I want to show you the simplest way to get a list, like we did with the list view simple. There are at least two types of fragments. So one of them is ListFragment, which means this fragment is only going to have or behave like a list view. The first thing we're going to do is override public override. I think we'll give us a void on activity created. So this fragment is going to grab the data from our data source. For that, we need, in this example, we need to make a reference to the services namespace, so we can instantiate I think we call it my services. Let's call it the service, and new my services, and so this will allow us to create a list of type my data. Let's call this object my data with all capitals. In capital, my data equals the service that get my data. Now, since we are showing only the simplest of the lists, which takes only text, we are going to extract, let's extract the names. So let's create another list of type string called the names. Okay, let's instantiate it, and let's extract from our my data object just the names, so we can use the names for each in my data. The names that add item name. Now we have a collection of names in the dnames array object. Okay, so the list fragment, just like the list activity, has a property, the list adapter property, that we can instantiate here with an array adapter of type string that requires, actually the context in this case is not this, it's the activity. And requires an Android resource layout. Let's see, list, in this case let's use list item checked, and the incoming data, which is the names. Okay, so let's go to main. And let's add a fragment to the form. There we go. So this is the content of our fragment. Let's give it an ID. So let's call it the main fragment. And let's give it a name. So the namespace is fragments basic. That, and then it was main fragment. It's the name of our fragment. We can use name or we can use class. Let me show you what it would look like if we wanted to use classes instead. Class, and then exactly the same as right here. Class equals Control C. Okay, we can use either of these two. It doesn't like it. It doesn't like the class. I'm not sure. I haven't researched why, but it doesn't matter. Let's use name so it doesn't complain. Okay, so now we have our ID as main underscore fragment and the name as fragments basic dot main fragment. Here in our main activity, when the activity starts, it will instantiate all the fragments that it finds in the main layout. So there's nothing else to do, so let's crank it up. And as you can see, we get the activity with the list of names that we expected. Now I'd like to show you how this fragment can be reused in a separate activity. So let's create a second activity, let's go over here and let's add a new item, and it's going to be activity. Let's call it second activity. It is an activity. It's going to be called second activity. So let's create a layout for the second activity, which, well, first let's add a button to the main activity, which is going to call the second activity. Okay, so right here we're going to add a button that is going to send us to the second activity. Second activity. Okay. Okay, so let's go to main, and this is where we're gonna call it. So let's get a handle on our button. So let's call it button go to second. Equals, let's find it by ID of type button, and the resource ID is going to be, it still has not refreshed, button, what do we call it? Let's call it, what's it, main, right here. We called it, let's get the source, button to second activity. Let's copy and paste. Okay, so we get the red squiggly line because we need to refresh our resource designer, and hopefully it did it, and it did not. Let me close and reopen the application. Actually, we don't need that. Let's go to button. Let's create a click listener, and let's call this lambda expression. And right here, we're going to create an intent. Equals no intent. We need the context, this, and type of the activity, that second activity, where we want to go. Start the activity, start activity for that intent. Let's fix this with quick actions. We need using Android context. Okay. Okay, so what I did is I closed the solution, reopened it, and everything refreshed. So let's change the title of each one of our activities so we know where we are, because we're going to see exactly the same list on both, since the fragment that we are using for both activities is the same, but the title should be different. So Fragments basic, let's call it main, and for the second activity, let's call it, well, it's gonna have second activity. Okay, we haven't created the layout for the second activity, so let's do that now. So this is an Android layout, and let's call it layout underscore second activity. Add. And the layout for the second activity is going to look the same as the layout for main. So let's copy and paste. Actually, the fragment is the one that we want to copy and paste. Okay, let's go to source. Okay, right here. And this is going to be the linear layout. Okay, so we have the fragment. Let's call this, instead of main, fragment. Okay, it's looking better. Okay, as you can see here, we're referencing the main fragment, the only fragment that we have, and it doesn't really matter the name that we use here. Okay, so our second activity will be referencing the layout second activity. Let's see if it works this time without having to close the activity. There we go. So just refreshing, the resource designer gave us a good reference to our second layout. So everything should be fine. And let's compile and test. And as you can see, for the first, the main activity, we see at the top fragments, basic main. And the second activity is showing us the title, second activity, and the list, exactly the same list as before, because it is the same fragment. So you can see the reusability of fragments inside of different activities. Okay, now I'd like to show you a third way to create a fragment. This time is going to be programmatically, which means there is no layout file. Okay, there are a couple of things that we need to do. First of all, we need to go to our main fragment, and we need to add a new method that's going to be a public static main fragment, a new instance, and any parameters that we might want to use. In this case, we are not. So we create an object that I'm calling main fragment, that is an instantiation of the fragment with a new instantiation of the bundle as arguments, and then we return the main fragment. Return main fragment. Okay, this is going to help us create the fragment programmatically. So the next step is to create a third activity. We're gonna call the same, or we're going to create an instance of this fragment inside of a third activity. So let's create our third activity, and remember, no layout for the third activity. So let's add a new item. Let's call it third activity. Add. And let's do the same thing with our It's our main layout. Let's add a second button. So the easiest would be go to third activity, and the button is going to be called go to third activity. Okay, and let's go to main, our main activity, and let's copy and paste the buttons. Since they are so similar, we can go to third. Let's call this one third, and this one was third activity. Yeah, and here we want third click. Has not refreshed the references, but right here let's okay, third activity and start activity intent. Okay, so let's refresh the resource designer. Hopefully pick it up. Now let me close the solution and reopen it. I'll be back. And that did it. And let's go to the third activity and label it accordingly. Well, third activity, let's put same list. Okay, and now the third activity, as you can see, there is no layout for it. Okay, so in the third activity, we need to create an object. Let's call it the fragment equals main fragment dot new instance with no parameters, and then we're going to use the transaction manager. Let me show you how. And let's start a new transaction. Let's call it var fragment transaction fragment manager being transaction, and we add transaction add the fragment. So we need to find that fragment, Android resource ID content and the fragment. And we commit the transaction. Fragment transaction dot commit. So let's test it. And as you can see, it's working perfectly. We have the fragments basic main with the two buttons. The second button says go to third activity. When we click on it, we get the title of the third activity that says, and the same list as expected. Well, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another of our Xamarin Android videos.